anything about Buddhist communication ethics before, and started it in the course this year, really because in the past, when I'd done a segment in this course on communication ethics about the post-colonial, about multicultural, about extending beyond the assumption that Western conceptions can be universalized, it was a wee bit abstract. And this is, for me, a fantastic way of thinking quite specifically about, well, if we want to extend beyond, versions of journalism ethics that have basically come out of the Christian tradition, but have been kind of, my perspective would be that they've been cleaned through philosophy, but they've still basically got a lot of Christian ethics attached to them. How do we step beyond that? Some people would use Ubuntu kind of ethics, or we have looked in the past at the Maori cultural context and said, well, what ethical, how does that change the way we think about ethics? And we'll be doing a bit of that too. But when I heard you talking at the conference last year, I thought, this is absolutely fantastic. This is stretching us in ways that would be really, really useful. So that's my agenda.
Well, thank you, Donald. And as a preamble and a disclaimer, I might say that I'm quite new to this whole area myself, and I've been really guided by the lead author and editor of the book we've just produced, Shelton Gunaratne, who has actually been working in this space for several decades. So, excuse me if I don't know the exact Pali word for various Buddhist terms and so on.
Yeah. No, that's great. Just before we get going, shall I just introduce the students so you know who we all are? Do you want to just start, Amelie?
Oh, yeah, sure. I'm Amelie, and I'm an exchange student from Denmark. I study at the Danish School of Media and Journalism back home.
Yes, I know that school, and I've just been hosting some people here in Australia from that program. So,
interesting.
So,
okay.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Inga and Henrik, some of your colleagues, we'd been there in Canterbury, and then they came over to set up a similar program with us at Griffith University.
Yeah, and I'm Peter, and I'm also from Denmark and from the same school.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Jenny. I'm from Finland, from the University of Helsinki.
Hi, Jenny.
Hello.
Hi, I'm Kirsten. I'm from here, the University of Canterbury.
Hi, Kirsten.
And I'm Holly, and I'm also from the University of Canterbury.
Hi, Holly. Great to see you all.
The course that we're doing, and there's a couple of people who are absent. One guy, because we've got a photo of his leg is in, he's just had a major operation, plus a few others who couldn't make it, so we're slightly larger usually. But this group is the course which is the kind of thing that is part of the exchange between our universities that you were talking about with Inger, a similar kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So we're benefiting from their entrepreneurial spirit over there in Denmark. Fantastic the way they set these things up.
Yeah.
Shall we get into it then?
Let's, please, yeah.
So just to start with, I think probably for me the starting, I'll start, and these guys have been told they have to ask questions, so there'll be meaningful silences at times until they come up with questions.
I'm used to that with students, yeah.
My starting position is, how can we translate a Buddhist ethic or a Buddhist informed ethics to a Western context? Are we on is there a risk that we're on a hiding to nothing, that there's some kind of something incommensurate going on?
Well, incommensurability is obviously an interesting issue, and that's part of the communication literature looking at intercultural communication.
Yes,
and it applies in this area as much as any other. So I guess as a starting point, I don't think there's any single framework that is, has proprietary rights over looking at ethics in any context, or at communication theory for that matter. I've just been doing an article on this topic for the International Communication Gazette, and part of that was looking at different cultural approaches from throughout the world. It's surprising that, given the nature of communication scholarship and the academy that it has been that European or US framework that has been rewarded, and therefore, while you see many Asian and African names on prominent top-level academic journal articles, typically they're applying a Western theoretical framework to their work. But when you look deeply enough, you find some really interesting work, and I found some from recent years, and the authors' names are escaping me for the moment, but nevertheless there was someone from Africa who was looking at traditional tribal approaches of inquiry and applying those to communication studies. Another using Hinduism from India, and another a Chinese scholar using Confucian and Taoist approaches to communication. So I think this is quite encouraging and invigorating that so many people throughout the world are adopting different theoretical approaches based in different cultures. Now, I'm somewhat of a, as I said, I'm a babe in the woods as far as Buddhist phenomenology goes. And while I've certainly been interested in Eastern cultures and philosophies since my undergraduate days, it's not an area I've worked in until quite recent years. And part of that has been through, for personal reasons, through doing a little bit more meditation in my life and exploring that end more as a lay person going into it. But as I've done so, and the reason for this whole journey into mindful journalism, as I've done so, you can't help thinking at a professional level or at a research level about some of the things you're practicing personally and what application they might have. And, in some ways I wish I had all my time again as a journalist, because it would have been wonderful working in mainstream journalism and trying to apply many of these approaches to fundamental journalism ethical questions. Coming back to your question though, is it incompatible with a Christian informed communication practice that we have, and it's quickly becoming the international approach? My answer is I think it's not. I think we have to accommodate a whole host of approaches in this internationalised, globalised era of communication.
Yeah. So the media are becoming more global. You absolutely have to broaden the ethical frameworks you use. Yeah.
Yes, and it doesn't mean that Buddhism takes over the whole space. I really think that once we delve back into both the cultural and the religious traditions internationally, we actually find that people have been grappling with similar intellectual problems for centuries or millennia, and it's just that they've been using different frameworks to approach them.
Yeah, Clifford Christians has got a paper where he tries to work through these. He talks about dignity, justice, care as being kind of fundamentals which run through. You can't find a tradition which doesn't have those. So there's fundamentals that we share.
Yes, and I guess what attracted me with the Buddhist approach is that in most of the other traditions you have to dig deeply, like Clifford Christians has done, to find each of them. They are there. Whereas the Buddhists, and I think it's because it was an oral tradition for centuries, they're big with lists, so you've got the 5 precepts, the 4 noble truths, the 8-fold path, and I'm told this was because for the oral tradition, for memorising, for handing it down, it was much easier to have numbers and lists of set numbers of things to remember, and that's where you have these principles that Christians, as in Clifford Christians, has elicited in Buddhism, certainly through the 8-fold path. They are actually listed as 8 actual principles of ethical inquiry.
Yeah. Actually, got students to ask something. Thanks for that.
Hi.
So, Kirsten.
Yes. So Donald was talking about how we've kind of cleaned up our Western, I guess, philosophies of overtly Christian overtones. Do you think a similar approach should be taken with Buddhist communication ethics to make it more? Because I feel like even in this class we've had some criticism that it's a bit too overtly Buddhist. Do you think it could be made more palatable to people with those criticisms?
Okay, well that's a reasonable question, and I do understand that. Like, you've got to remember that Buddhism is not expressed in any single way, and Buddhism as well has been culturally adopted by different countries and different societies. So some of the writing, and particularly the book we've written, is quite dominated by Theravada Buddhism, and which has emanated, well, the co-authors are from Sri Lanka, and the language that was used there was Pali. And therefore you find all of these different Pali words to use to express phenomena that can be quite easily expressed in English. When I say quite easily, I mean maybe something is lost in translation, but then again, what we're finding is that there is a westernized approach to Buddhism today where in many ways it's actually quite secular. In its negative sense, it's sometimes dubbed mindfulness because people cherry pick various aspects of Buddhist philosophy, and particularly the meditation and so on, and then start to apply it in really quite problematic contexts when you start looking at all of the other teachings. So, for example, you might get a New Age business bestseller that talks about using mindfulness to get more out of your employees and maximise your profits, that kind of thing. So, and in some ways, what we've been doing with journalism, or certainly what I've been doing as a Westerner, is could be criticised that way, because really, what is the mindful journalist? Which parts of Buddhism, or what you've described as sometimes the foreign-sounding or quite technical aspects of Buddhism, should be adopted to explore journalism ethics. And what I would say is that, yes, all of that criticism is true, but there are ways where we need to look at Buddhism through our modern Western eyes and modern communication and basically and the level of scientific knowledge that we have today, and say, are there key features of this, putting aside the language, are there key features that are worth embedding in A, our ethical approaches to our own life and our occupation, and B, are there worthwhile tools within it that we can use in the study of communication? So I'm not sure you need all of those technical terms that might seem so threatening perhaps, or as if you've got to sort of suddenly learn the whole manual of those terms. I don't think you need those to create a basic toolbox through which you can both examine your own ethical practice and look at the communication writings and theories of others when you're using it in an academic context.
Thank you.
Guys?
This might seem like I'm asking too much here, but when you say that you believe you need a whole lot of different aspects from various ethical frameworks to approach any issues, are there main aspects of Buddhism ethics that you feel we can't get from other ethical frameworks, or is it situational?
No. I believe you can approach ethics quite easily from any of the great religious standpoints of the world. So if your own moral framework is Muslim, for example, I'm sure you can draw from the Quran what will probably amount to quite similar points that are neatly numbered in Buddhism, if you delve into them to find them. There will be cultural differences. And we know, because all of our great philosophers that we study in these sorts of courses, most of them have come from a Christian tradition, and that's the whole Anglo-Christian approach that is taught in British and American universities to ethics. So we know that they're sitting there in Christianity, which has informed our legal system and our philosophical approaches. So I don't wish to impose a Buddhism toolkit upon everybody. I think each of us can look to our own moral compass as the starting point. What I think this Buddhism or mindful approach offers, though, is for people who are struggling with fundamental religious or moral starting point, and particularly those of the last couple of generations who've been brought up in what they perceive to be a very secular society, and in many ways an atheist society, and have adopted certain parts of philosophies. They've done their own cherry picking to that extent, and they're kind of in denial that a lot of this has actually stemmed from Christianity anyway. So I think the mindful journalism approach is there for people who want a quick and easy list that is not laden with religion, because Buddhism can be just seen in its phenomenological or philosophical or even psychological terms. It wasn't pitched as a theistic religion. So they're sitting there as a simple toolkit to apply if you already lack one. And that basic toolkit consists of what is described as the eightfold path. And the eightfold path means you would say it was a journalism problem you were examining. You would start by looking at your own intent, which is the principle of right intent. So what am I, where am I coming from when I'm addressing this ethical problem? What am I intending through my actions here? The second strand is right knowledge. So you basically would ask yourself in simple lay terms, do I have the knowledge I need to be able to address this ethical problem properly? The third is right livelihood, and we can look at that in general senses and sort of say, well, there are some occupations that just do not lend themselves to ethical practice. Some might argue that journalism is like that, and certainly in some strands of journalism you have to question the livelihood. For example, celebrity or gossip style journalism, or journalism involved in creating advertorials and these sorts of things that might have some basic ethical flaw in the livelihood. But most journalism has a mission or some kind of public service backbone to it, so that's okay. Right thought is the next one. So can I be introspective and assess my thinking about this problem? Then there's right speech. Am I using the right communication mode and the right words to talk about this, being fair to those involved? Right action. Is my research ethically sound? Is it? Am I approaching my sources in the right way? Have I behaved appropriately for the particular story and the circumstances? Right mindfulness, which involves that meditative perspective. Have I paused to reflect upon all of these issues and gone into some kind of space that gives me the time to reflect upon them? And finally, right concentration, which is where It's kind of like being in the zone, or applying one's mind in a very focused and professional way to the problem at hand. So you can see that that's not in Pali terms, but you can see that when we start thinking about those 8 steps towards any ethical problem, we can draw upon what might be our own religious tradition, but still consciously work our way through those steps to come to a very considered conclusion or action in a professional context.
Others, a question?
Well, I have one. Like, I would want to know, like, more on a concrete level, like, how does a mindful journalist's work differ from a normal mainstream journalist?
Yes, well, this is still, don't forget that the term mindful journalism has only been around for 18 months or so, so I'm not sure that there are hordes of mindful journalists out there in the workplace. I'm sure there are many, many mindful journalists, it's just that they haven't used that term to describe themselves as such. But how would their journalism differ? Well, at one level, journalists have their code of ethics, and this is not a proposal to do away with ethical codes, but ethical codes, while often they have some sort of preamble that talks in terms of truth and respect for others and the public's right to information, these sorts of terms, the actual clauses of journalism ethical codes are actually quite professionally technical. Things like, do not betray the confidence of your sources, do not use discriminatory language, do not secretly record people, without telling them this. So, for someone who claims to be an ethical journalist and just has this little technical ethical handbook of their ethical code, you start to wonder what moral basis they're drawing upon to follow that guidebook. Because with any such ethical code, there's an enormous amount of wriggle room. There's a lot of ability to go back to those guiding precepts and say, oh yes, but the public's right to information is more important here. So that's why it's so important that I secretly record this conversation or whatever the behaviour is. Whereas the mindful journalist would go through these other steps that I've just explained to you. They wouldn't just say, oh, the public's right to information is more important. That would be one consideration. But they would say, okay, well, what am I really intending by doing this secret recording? Whose interests are being affected? Is this really the right action in these circumstances? Have I paused to think about the interests of all of the different stakeholders involved, including the broader public's right to information? Depending on how Buddhist they want to get about it, they might start thinking in terms of compassion, and that's where you're considering the real interests of stakeholders. Now, you can't have a public interest for the state journalism that doesn't upset anybody. I mean, that's ridiculous to say that would be the case. And so you then start to draw upon other Western philosophical traditions in trying to weigh up, I guess, whether your end justifies your means and those sorts of things. But the mindful journalist is doing this in a very considered way, whereas what you might call the ethical journalist sometimes is just looking for the wiggle room within their code of ethics to allow them to do something that might advance their own interests or advance sometimes the commercial interests of the organisation that they're working for.
Yeah, for me that's the utilitarianism is the one to put in the opposite pole if you're thinking about ethical frameworks, because I think a weakness of it is it allows this massive get-out-of-jail card of the public interest, which can justify any means, and as many ethicists have said, it risks being having no basis at all. By trying to be scientific, it risks being grounded in nothing, which is, I think, where you're reaching into Buddhist traditions to try to find. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. And utilitarianism, I think, feeds directly into the press system of libertarianism, and what we're proposing with mindful journalism would sit more closely with what we'd call a social responsibility framework for journalism, which allows for public service journalism. And we're not, we're not claiming any great proprietary rights again over this. There are many people who've done terrific work in that space. So you've got public and civic journalism, which adopts that social responsibility approach, which has been around for decades. You have peace journalism, which is, it dates back to Galtung and Rouge, and they're looking partly at other traditions like Buddhism, but more recently it's been really developed by the likes of Jake Lynch out of Sydney, and peace journalism looks at ways of using journalism to dissipate or to reduce conflict situations rather than to exacerbate conflict situations for the sake of getting more news and creating more conflict. So there's that. There's Viritsa Rupa's excursion into inclusive journalism, which has very strong European traditions. So I think all of these things have a lot in common. That's okay. They have a lot in common. What I would suggest is mindful journalism can be applied to almost all types of journalism that we pursue, whereas sometimes some of these other ones, peace journalism lends itself more to international relations reporting, war correspondence, that kind of thing. Inclusive journalism is a direct attempt to introduce more tolerance in journalism where there are multiracial or multicultural communities and so on, whereas I'd suggest that mindful journalism has a broader application and it can be used in all different types of journalism, but it doesn't have as strict set must-do boxes to tick.
Yeah, it's not trying to solve one particular problem, which some of these others are.
That's true.
Yeah. Did you want to ask?
Yeah. Do you think it's realistic that mindful journalism could become a big thing for like bigger corporations and stuff? Because I think it might be difficult to apply on a larger scale.
Well, I think it was my Danish friends who were telling me recently that there is quite, a medium-sized regional journalism outlet in Denmark, where the editor has his staff go into a small meditation session each day, which is taking mindful journalism much further than I'd ever envisaged. So I think it's certainly possible, but I think what's more likely is that I use it today. I'm a blogger and I use it, and I stop to think through the various ramifications that might be there for the various work that I produce. But then I'm not trying to meet 24/7 deadlines and moderating the comments of all sorts of people with axes to grind and sometimes mental illnesses in the community that are shooting off nasty comments. So I think it certainly has potential to be used at an individual level. So individual journalists, no matter what the pace of their work and the demands being put upon them, could draw upon some of these principles for some personal mental refuge in a crazy 24/7 news context. But news managers might also consider it. So I think some of the basic questions, like what is our intent here? What are we really trying to do with this? Could be a basic question that could be asked in the editorial conference each day with important stories as they're being discussed. And a question like, with the right action, well, who's getting impacted here and how are we weighing up the impact upon them? I think those are questions that could be at least take a place at the table along with how we're going to maximise our circulation or our page views or our ratings through this particular story.
When we talked in class, the phrase, I think I might have brought it up to draw out someone else's point, the phrase Asian values came up, which of course you can connect to the Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir's attempts to reduce critical scrutiny of his own government, including the amount of money his own family was making out of various bits and pieces. Is there a risk that the pursuit of harmony is less critical than journalism needs to be? That's actually a criticism that's made of lots of more socially responsible forms of journalism, isn't it? So it's not unique to this approach, that criticism. Journalists should be a thorn in the side, and if they're doing anything else, they're losing their critical edge. It's kind of, the criticism.
Well, a basic definition of news is, news is something that upsets someone somewhere, and all the rest is advertising. Let's first deal with the Asian values thing, and I don't believe Buddhism is Asian. Okay, I don't, and just as Christianity isn't Western, so I think you've got different, different frameworks that that might be mixed.
Yes.
Secondly, I think Buddhism and Buddhist principles, or certainly Buddhism as a religion, like any other religion, once it's institutionalized, it can become heavily politicized, and it can be used for immoral and some might say evil purposes. And so you look at predominantly Buddhist countries throughout the world, and some of them have had all sorts of historical crises and terrible atrocities and civil unrest happening in them. So I think it's a mistake to start just putting things into those baskets.
Yeah.
As far as the issue of trying to pursue harmony at the expense of conflict, I think there's some middle ground we can reach there. There is no doubt that journalism is one of the important functions of journalism is to tell the truth, and sometimes that truth can be unpalatable to some people. And one of the chapters I wrote for the book was to do with this phenomenon of right speech, and it dates back to what were deemed to be the Buddha's teachings in this area. And he purportedly talked about what speech is acceptable and gave certain criteria to that speech. And he felt that untruthful speech was really never acceptable. Unbeneficial speech was never acceptable. Speech that might cause someone emotional upset or suffering is never acceptable. So he went through these various aspects of speech. There are about 5 or 6 of them. But he allowed for situations where speech that might be truthful but might upset some people, but still might be beneficial after due consideration and reflection. If you're mindful about its use, then it can and sometimes should be spoken. So as long as there is benefit coming from it, and that's where we start getting into discussions about who it's benefiting, if it's beneficial, even though it might cause disharmony, it is certainly what we set about doing in the business of journalism. So, and it is condoned within basic Buddhist teachings.
Yeah.
I don't think you'd find the Dalai Lama as someone who particularly backs away from a very strong argument on issues of human rights and from strong criticism of those who might be infringing upon human rights, particularly those to do with Tibet. So if you see what the Tibetans see as a leading Buddhist figure engaging in that sort of speech, then I think there's hope for a good, strong public interest journalism as well.
Yeah. Okay, we're using up oodles of your time, so we should probably not carry on too much longer. Does anyone want to wrap up with another question?
I have one that kind of strays a little bit from Buddhist ethical theory in saying that has ethically reflective meditation time within journalistic practice led you to find uses for meditation in other aspects of life? So just curiously, on a personal level, what are your feelings towards meditation?
Yeah, well, I certainly, I try to meditate every day for at least 5 minutes or so. I think we all actually meditate, but it's not necessarily always a conscious meditation because we're always reflecting upon problems and so on. And there are so many different approaches to meditation. I mean, you don't have to take up the lotus position in the middle of a busy newsroom in your robes to meditate. I argue in one of the recent articles I wrote that there was a strong tradition of smoking breaks for journalists over the years, and in some ways the smoko break can be repurposed, I think retooled and repurposed to a short time out where you might just find some solitude to practice what's called vipassana meditation, which is basically applying your insight to a particular problem at hand. And I could see great value for that 5 to 10 minutes space. So, but it's really, your question talked about how has all this come to affect my personal life. It's really been the other way. It's actually, for me, it's been that it's grown in my personal life over recent years, and that's when I started to see the applications in a professional context. So I think it can be everything from that Danish newspaper organisation actually having the whole staff go through a meditation daily, right through to people on an individual basis just choosing to take time out from their busy, stressful work practice to find a little bit of mental space, either to apply themselves to an ethical issue or just simply to clear their minds of their work, because once you come back, you often find a lot more clarity when you're addressing the problem at hand at work if you've managed to clear your mind a little for a few minutes.
Yeah. You make it sound really, actually, when you reduce it down to individual actions like that, it seems not only commonsensical, you think, what have we been doing when we haven't been doing that? What workplace or what professional practice wouldn't benefit from that kind of reflection?
Yeah, and I think the reflection, certainly I've found a lot of benefit in the right speech approach, because I have over the years been a little bit abrupt, a bit snappy with people, a little bit intolerant of people's, around me. Whereas this, at a personal level, this has prompted me just to pause before I say something that might be critical or negative, just think through it a little bit first, and then perhaps rephrase it in a way that is not as damaging to the individual I'm talking to, but actually is a benefit to our relationship and to the workplace more generally.
Yeah, that's nice. Thank you. How are we doing? And thank you, Mark. I don't know what we've taken you from, what other output you would have been meeting for Griffith University at the moment, but we're really, really grateful for that. Just to drop things and with no no actual gain for yourself to come into our classroom like this at short notice. Thanks very much.
No, I found it really useful, Donald. So thank you all for some great questions, and good luck with your studies in this area.
Okay.
Thank
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. We'll let you go.
And, Donald, I'm all signed up for Queenstown, so looking forward to catching up with you again there.
Yep, we'll see you there, and it is such a beautiful spot. You're big